Hey everyone, in this presentation I'm going to talk about Mearsheimer's 1990 article, Back to the Future, Instability in Europe After the Cold War, published in International Security. International Security, again, it's a journal that every journal has different styles, and International Security is a little more of a journal. It's not completely a political science journal. It has a slightly different format. There's not a abstract, and it uses footnotes instead of in-text references. So, in some ways that's problematic for an early one, an early paper. But on the other hand, the writing is not as esoteric, right? So uh, Mearsheimer is writing for a security audience, not a political science audience, and therefore he's going to explain things in simpler terms. So it makes it kind of a good article for this circumstance in terms of the substance of it. So keep that in mind. As always, I've got the citation here, although I put date accessed instead of the date I accessed it. When you look at this, you're going to put your own date in there. But again, here we have the reference to it, and we'll have citations, of course, throughout. Okay, one thing I want to point out: offensive versus defensive realism. Waltz is Mr. Neorealism, and neorealism is often, there are other qualifiers put on it. Structural realism, that's actually what Waltz likes to call it, the emphasis on the structure of the international system, which will be very much in evidence here with Mearsheimer. Also, it's called defensive realism. Waltz is going to talk about, he generally talks about states maximizing security, and therefore, uh, you know, seeking to balance power. Mearsheimer is often described as being an offensive realist who views states as seeking to maximize power, and therefore they don't stop at balancing, right? They will seek to gain power and use that to achieve their goals. And so Mearsheimer is less into balancing. And one thing you'll notice is throughout this paper, he will never talk about balancing. He will talk about equality of power and talk about aspects that can make that good or bad, but he will avoid the term balance of power rather well in some ways, because he's being descriptive about power and not just doing it. But so that's an interesting difference. Although I got to say that in this paper, I don't know how offensive he's being, but he does see states as striving to gain their points and being more conflictual than Waltz does as a rule. So just keep that, and that's something that's going to come up. But Mearsheimer, another difference between Mearsheimer and Waltz is Waltz tends to try to be more scientific, more theory bound, and more systemic, looking at the international system more. Mearsheimer very much is very much into like foreign policy, and frequently looks at bilateral relations between states and the development of their policy, and so he is a lot less pure. I mean, would we call him a neorealist? I actually like to think of him as more of a realist than a neorealist, but that's, you know difficult to say. And honestly, the neo thing gets added and dropped a lot. And Stephen Krasner, I sat in on a few of his lectures at Stanford, and he's a realist. And he said, someone asked him about neorealism. He said, if they put neo in front of it, they just means they don't know what they're talking about. And see, he himself kind of didn't like the term. So we have to, but if someone uses neorealism, they're talking about neorealism and Waltz. If someone uses realism, they might be talking neorealist. Well, they might, they probably are. But yeah, keep that in mind. Okay, let's get to the article. Bottom line up front, right? He lays out the neo-realist argument for what is expected to happen in Europe after the end of the Cold War. And this is being written in 1990, and the Berlin Wall comes down in '89, and suddenly the Soviet Union suddenly there seems to be an end to the Cold War, and everyone who's been doing international relations is like, what's going on? His premise is that the U.S. is going to withdraw from Europe, and he's going to make the prediction, and it's a very straightforward realist prediction, right? That we're going, and so even though, like I say, Mearsheimer sometimes doesn't adhere to the strict theory, here he gives it pretty much. That's why I picked this article, because he really lays it out in just a few pages. This prediction that multipolarity will reign in Europe and lead to instability. And he's going to say that what we should do is we should have a limited nuclear proliferation. The U.S. should not withdraw from Europe, and we should seek to forestall hyper-nationalism in Europe. Now, that last bit is odd. And again, so now we're back to, Mearsheimer. Here he steps out of the theory. Strictly speaking, to talk about hypernationalism in a state is to talk about ideology. It's to talk about a domestic characteristic of the state, which is not what realism is about. And if a student was to suggest that this was part of the realist argument, I'd grade it down, and I'd be freaking right. But Mearsheimer does not, you don't have to be, everything a realist says doesn't have to be realist in nature, right? You can step outside the theory, and it doesn't have to completely define you. So, however, like I say, I big warning label. This whole interest in hypernationalism is very much outside what is considered the realist theory, right? And so he's really stepping outside the bounds of realism here. Of course, he's just trying to predict Europe. He's not trying to be pure, right? So I guess that's how we look at it. But so look at that. A couple things to point out. Prediction. Theories predict. They explain the causal linkages. And so one of the important functions of them is to predict what will happen in the future. And so he's trying to use realism in 1990 to predict what will happen in Europe. 30 years later, his predictions look a bit off, right? And so we have one nice thing is we can look at someone's prediction 30 years later and say, okay, how good was it, right? He makes a very, in making the prediction, he is showing you how to use realism and to make the argument. So like I say, right up front, page 6 to 8, he just lays out the argument. And, if you get that out of the paper, that's good, right? Because that's realism. That's, they go to power, they look at the distribution of power, and they use that to explain how the world's likely to be. That is the overarching point, and it's bottom line up front here. Okay, and so we're going to go on and look at some other stuff that we can get out of this paper as well. He describes anarchy, and this is a big thing. The realism is always associated with these concepts, right? That the world is anarchic, that there's no overarching power, that states have to employ self-help, right? And that's actually his second point. He's not using the term self-help, but that's the term we apply to the second point, that states have to they have to provide their own anarchy. That's part of anarchy. They have to look after themselves, and so states are security maximizers, right? They're primary. This will come up actually much later in his argument. He will push back against economic liberalism by asserting the core assumption of realism that security is a primary concern that is superior to all others and is inherently conflictual and competitive, not cooperative, right? And that will come up later under economic liberalism. But these are the fundamentals here. Oh, and notice for this slide presentation, I have strictly gone with, I've left the commas out of my citation. to be strictly in line with APSA. I don't mind that sometimes I leave the commas in because I think that's not important. What is important is I have everything you need there to know, I have quotation marks. And again, something this big would be double indented in a paper, but here I can't double it. Doesn't make sense. So I've got quotation marks to show this is a quote and where exactly did it come from. And of course, it's very functional right now because I want you to know where I am, right? Yeah. But another example of citation, although very often when you write, you aren't going to use quotes. You're going to paraphrase and talk about Mearsheimer this and Mearsheimer that. And so, but we'll leave that alone. Anarchy. So we have a good discussion of anarchy. Always want to keep that in mind. Balance and distribution of power, right? And here in this section, he discusses, the competitive world is peaceful when it is obvious that the costs and risks of going to war are high and the benefits of going to war are low. And then he talks about the incentive structure, right? And the distribution of power between states and the nature of power available. Now I cut off the second part. But the distribution of power, this is the key thing. This is my point. The distribution of power tells us how well-positioned states are to commit aggression and whether other states are able to check their aggression. And this distribution is a function of the number of poles in the system, their relative power. Here we go. This is polarity. We're talking polarity. And so he is discussing the functions here. Now notice he's not talking about a balance of power because balance of power is emphasized if you think that when there's a balance of power that the costs of going to war are high and the prospects of, we don't really know much about the benefits of war in that case, what's being fought over, but it's unlikely, it's most questionable whether you're going to win or lose, right? When there's a balance of power. And so why would you do it? That's the thing. That is the Waltzian view. He is avoiding balance of power, but giving the conditions that Waltz assumes to exist under balance of power, right? He's saying, okay, here's the calculus. And notice it's very much a cost-benefit rational calculus. And this is, again, the idea that states are unitary actors and they rationally make decisions, right? About cost, basically cost effect, they're trying to seek some outcome here. And so all of this reflects that. So distribution of power, polarity, again, this is core to realism. And the typical mistake that students make is to get wrapped up on anarchy and self-help and all that other stuff and ignore this focus on polarity. By the way, he will go on to talk about the nature of the military power, the offense-defense balance. A lot of you will find that interesting. That's cool. And Waltz will talk about nuclear weapons are considered to be something that, kind of changes the calculus. And they talk about, and there is a whole subject, field of research that talks about whether military technology favors the offense or defense, and at different times in history, technology has favored the defense. For instance, in World War I, technology greatly favored the defense, but in World War II, with the introduction of armor and mobility, the balance shifted to offense, and now with nukes, more back to defense. So that's what he's talking about there. Look at that stuff, but I'm purposely focusing you on the first part, distribution of power, because that is one of the important parts of realism that people need to focus on. Bipolarity versus multipolarity. He talks about, he gives you a good explanation on page 14 of why bipolarity is superior to multipolarity. He goes into some detail. Basically, the key thing about bipolarity is simple, right? And in multipolarity, it's more complicated. It's easier to make mistakes. There are more opportunities, to make miscalculations, and this is what he's basically, this is part of the explanation of why multipolarity is bad. I kind of like, Waltz is typically described, and it's one of these questions of, are we sure he ever, not even sure he ever actually used the term, but when referring to Waltz, we often talk about, again, balance of power is his thing. When there's a balance of power, you don't get war. In a multipolar system, there is not a natural balance of power. This would be Waltz's explanation, right? Not Mearsheimer's, but they're similar, right? In a multipolar system, you have three or more roughly equal powers, and so there isn't a natural balance between two sides, right? And that there is in bipolarity. And so that's the argument, and that Waltz is going to make, that Mearsheimer doesn't, but they're both basically talking about the same thing, that the system is more uncertain. And the way I would describe it, from the Waltzian point of view, without a natural balance of power, we're dependent on alliances, and alliances are not, they're just words, they're not, you can't be sure what's going to happen there because it's anarchy, right? And therefore, states are always worried that their allies aren't going to support them, or that the other great powers are going to gang up on them, right? That's the lack of a natural balance of power. And Mearsheimer gives you another explanation at some length, which is really good, and wants you to pull that out. That's important. Empirical support. I found this statement really fascinating on page 18 when he says, there are no empirical studies that provide conclusive evidence of the effects of bipolarity and multipolarity on the likelihood of war. I'm like, interesting that you are, okay, you're owning up to the lack of empirical support for your theory. Interesting. Good, generally. And he goes on to say that this is a problem that typically in history there were multipolar systems. That most of our recorded evidence that we've got is about a bipolar system. So we really only have the Cold War as an example, right? And what's interesting is when you get to talking about the empirical support for democratic peace, which has a crap ton of empirical support, they're going to start picking at it like, oh, well, it's based on a short period of time, and there haven't been democracies for a long time, and la, 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 la. And it's interesting to hear he's talking about realism in this way, because it's pretty much the same thing that realists complain about democratic peace. So, the thing that's interesting, though, is Mearsheimer is going to go on to focus on the long peace, and he's going to, what he calls the long peace, which is going to be the Cold War, and he's going to be saying, look, we have the correlation of bipolarity and nuclear weapons. That's going to explain there's a perfect correlation between that and the long peace, and he's going to build a lot on that. And honestly, that's you could call it a case study. I wouldn't say he's done that. I would say he's making an anecdotal argument, based on basically one event. And that is problematic. And so right now, can't do much with that. But down the road, we're going to see other methods for doing that. And so here, he's going to base everything on this one example. And there you go. And so this is something that we're going to be questionable. And again, Mearsheimer is kind of a foreign policy. He's not as much of a strict social scientist as a lot of other people we're going to study are going to be. And so, like I say, he really comes off to me as kind of old school realism. Hypernationalism. Okay, he has a section on hypernationalism, and this is the belief that other nations or nation states are both inferior and threatening and must be dealt with harshly. Okay. Normally, like I say, realists deny the importance of such domestic variables, and it's interesting that he brings it up, right? And this is, by the way, this is more a liberal thing, right? The role of ideology in a state. Now, not quite constructivist in that, constructivism talks about the role of ideas, but in terms of shared ideas, that if everyone in the system has this concept, just like, when everyone in the system has a concept of that nation states are valid and that nation states have certain rights, this is a shared expectation and norm, right, of behavior. And hypernationalism, as he's describing it, it can be a domestic phenomena. And at that point, it's ideational, sure, but it's part of liberalism, because liberalism focuses on domestic level variables. And that tends to be the whereas realism doesn't, right? That's a big dividing line. He goes a little bit off script there as far as realism is concerned. Okay, moving on, he talks about competing theories, and he lays out three: economic liberalism, and then he talks about the peace-loving democracies theory, which is really kind of slamming it. That distorts it, right? Kant had the idea that republics would be pacific, that they would not like to go to war, and that idea has largely fallen by the wayside, right? And so democratic peace theory generally holds that, democracies are just as war prone as other countries. They just don't fight other democracies, right? And there's actually a lot of empirical support for this. And although people question how strong it is and how predictive it is for the future, but so be careful of that. He is kind of, I don't think intentionally, because it's 1990 and we're still developing democratic peace theory, but be careful of that. His representation of it is a bit off. Then he brings up the obsolescence of war, and this is something that is a different idea. It's from John Mueller, who wrote Retreat from Doomsday, and who just happened to be another one of my, you keep running across my professors, Bueno de Mesquita, right? And John Mueller wrote this book, Retreat from Doomsday, where he argued that war became obsolete in people's minds, that they thought that, you just don't think that you go to war and win anything from it, right? You don't get anything out of it. And this is actually, in 1990, the word would not have really been out yet, right? I mean, because the word being constructivism, it's just not there, right? Alexander Wendt hasn't published his stuff. I mean, it's on the horizon, but it's not there in 1990. It was not, and I was in graduates, in 1990, I was at University of Rochester with John Mueller. And Bruce Bueno de Mesquita would fly in to teach classes, right? We never heard of constructivism. We had no idea what it was. But it is a constructivist idea. The concept that people have this shared expectation that war is bad, that it doesn't really produce much. Whereas once in the 19th century, there was this idea that war, there were norms for fighting it and expectations, and there was the idea you would win and you would get stuff, right? You would win and you would make people pay you reparations. And so these are the competing theories. He argues that they can't explain the long peace, right? That economic liberalism doesn't explain why the United States and Soviet Union didn't fight, and it doesn't, because they had separate economic systems. And also that, peace-loving democracy. Well, the Soviet Union was not a democracy. The United States wasn't. And he argues, again, he thinks the obsolescence of war is the better, might apply, right? I mean, the other two, just on the face of them, do not apply to this situation. I mean, by their own terms, they don't work. Obsolescence of war is meant, is specifically meant to explain that. And Mueller argued in Retreat from Doomsday that even if we didn't have nukes, he thought that the war between the United States and the Soviet Union had become something to be avoided, not something that both sides expected to engage in to seek great advantage at some point, right? The point is, he argues against that, saying World War I should have taught people that war was not a good way to go. Uh, and so he has an argument there. So we'll leave that, and you can look at that. Point is, though, he's saying they don't explain the long peace, and I'm like, well, so what, right? I mean, they might explain the even perhaps longer peace in Europe after the Cold War. Of course, that hasn't occurred yet, right? And so, we'll see. But there you go. He talks about the competing theories and is looking at them and kind of creating this, okay, they can't explain the long peace argument. He goes on to make predictions, and this is the key thing. Now, he talks for a good 8 pages about nuclear weapons and potential states. And in some ways, and this is this whole thing about proliferation, and you can read that if you want. A lot of it is predicting what might happen to nukes, and in fact, what happened to nukes is not a damn thing changed, right? And so the previous ownership pattern continued, and I think though, okay, for it doesn't really help us in. So like I said, you could skip those 8 pages if you wanted. You could just kind of skim over them. He does talk about the 3 peaceful scenarios, and he basically brings up the obsolete wars, obsolete, and then kind of doesn't talk much more about it. The 2 things he really focuses on is the liberal model, and the scenario of peace is that the EC will expand to maintain the system of openness and keep things stable in Europe. No, he doesn't know about the EU, and he kind of riddles this prediction. And it's funny because 30 years later you're like, well, I mean, sure, there's Brexit, but still, come on. And so the EU became very strong, and so, but he kind of poo-poos it. And so his explanation of economic liberalism, when he lays out the argument, is actually, that's pretty good, right? So you should feel free to kind of take that on board, and that's a pretty good explanation of the logic. And then he gives kind of the standard realist argument that, well, the problem with liberals is they emphasize economic the gains from trade, the mutual benefits that come from trade, and they don't keep in mind that security is an inherently competitive thing, and that security concerns will trump economic concerns, right? And that is this is a standard realist line, that one, security is going to be a problem, and 2, that because security involves relative gains, not mutual gains, like, that the liberals are wrong, right? The liberal economic stuff doesn't hold water. And we can really question that. And so that is useful to look at. And that was the debate in the context of it, the lines of it. He, again, with democratic peace, he goes too much into democracies loving peace and being pacific, and the populations using the Kantian explanation, the populations won't want it. And the problem with democratic peace theory is there's a lot of support for the notion that democracies don't fight one another. Why they don't is a big question. And so Kant said it was because the populations would suffer and they wouldn't want war. He is using that one. There are many other explanations. Doyle is going to provide things about the nature of democratic governments, and he's going to have a little bit about the populations having an impact. Bueno de Mesquita et al. In selectorate theory is going to provide an institutional argument that has none of that, has nothing to do with that. Also, the questioning of whether, there's a lot more skepticism about whether democracy will take hold. And in fact, in a lot of Eastern Europe, Belarus, and now even Hungary seems to be sliding. There was a question of how democratic, lots of parts of the former Soviet Union are not democratic. However, big chunks of it are. Right. And so certainly the big powers in Western Europe stayed democratic. So there you go. The empirical analysis, though, in all of this does remain very anecdotal. And as we go forward, you are going to be exposed to, especially the whole democratic piece and liberalism thing. We're going to see quantitative, cross-sectional empirical analysis, and so you're going to see that there's a difference. So right now, it's okay to go with this, but keep in mind, he is arguing from anecdote, and looking back at it 30 years later, a lot of his scenarios seem, Europe did not go downhill like he suggested. Now, a big part of it is the U.S. didn't withdraw from Europe, right? So he could always say that, well, the United States did not withdraw from Europe. We didn't necessarily get hyper-nationalism. And even though the nukes didn't proliferate, the U.S. not withdrawing seems to have, he could argue that it's kept the lid on things. And so, you keep that in mind. That's a theoretical argument. The empirical analysis here is where we look at the facts and do they support the argument. Is very anecdotal. It's based on examples, and as we go through, we're going to see that there's a better way of doing it. And so I would be most critical of that. But he is making a prediction, and but the thing is, he makes predictions, but he's also trying to go back and argue off the record. Now, there's nothing wrong with that in general. And in fact, that's how we do things. We get an idea. We get theories, we then try to test them against the historical record, because that's what we've got. And if they are supported there, if the theory, quote unquote, predicts the past with accuracy, then we apply it to the future, right? And that's why we test the theory against the historical record. There's better ways of doing it than he does it here, but there's nothing wrong with the idea of it, okay, as I should say. And in fact, that's kind of what you want to do. So, okay, that's what we got. At 30 minutes, these things are taking a long time, but, I'm going into some more depth on these early papers in the course. As we go on, I hope to get these down to, more like 10, 15 minutes. But this paper, I hope it's a bit long, but it really does cover some ground, and so I think it is very useful, and I hope this presentation has helped you.